Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dottie Conway-LeBron with the McSilver Institute, along with the Community Technical Assistance Center and Managed Care Technical Assistance Center. And I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, the final webinar in a three-part series on autism spectrum disorders. Today we will learn about adolescents and young adults with ASD, as we look to understand how caregivers and behavioral health providers can address the challenges they face in transitioning to adulthood. We're pleased to be joined this afternoon by Dr. Peter Gerhardt, Executive Director of the EPIC School, located in Paramus, New Jersey, a school founded by a small group of families seeking quality education for their children with autism. Dr. Gerhardt has more than 35 years of experience utilizing the principles of applied behavior analysis to help adolescents and adults with autism spectrum disorders within educational, employment, residential, and community-based settings. He's the author and co-author of a number of articles and chapters on the needs of adolescents and adults with ASD and has presented nationally and internationally on this topic. Dr. Gerhardt serves as chairman of the Scientific Council for the Organization for Autism Research and is on numerous professional advisory boards, including the Cambridge Center for Behavioral Studies. But before we get started and hear from Peter, I want to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in today's event. Please note that upon joining the webinar, you've been placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation today. And if you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the host who will be able to assist you. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions for the Q&A portion of today's presentation by utilizing the chat box feature, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. If it's not visible, click the dialog bubble on the top right toolbar and it should appear. In order to ensure that we're able to answer any questions as time permits, we are requesting that you send in your questions at any point during the webinar and we will address them during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. So once again, thank you for joining us and I look forward to hearing from Peter. Let's get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dottie, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for asking me to be here today. I am quite happy to do this. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So we only have an hour, so why don't we get started? And for some reason, my slide, there we go. I think well, let me back up 1 second. Throughout this talk, one of the difficulties in doing a talk about autism spectrum disorders is that it's a spectrum. That this is a really diverse group of people. As a matter of fact, I think no one would argue with me if I said the heterogeneity within any group of autism, people on the spectrum, is pretty much the same as the heterogeneity among all of you who logged in today. So it's a really diverse group. In the DSM-5, there's autism 1, autism 2, autism 3. Hasn't really gotten into generally accepted vernacular yet, but I generally will use sort of as a distinguisher high verbal versus low verbal. I don't like the terms high functioning or low functioning. I think that they describe nothing except verbal behavior, that the person can talk, which quite honestly is often misleading in terms of their actual functioning level. I have clients who have very, very minimal verbal language, who have jobs and are part of a social community, and I have clients who have degrees from universities and sit in their parents' basement and play video games. My client with very limited verbal language is higher functioning in that scenario. So I use this distinction. It's an arbitrary distinction, but it's high verbal, low verbal. But the second point is, as we look at transitioning to adulthood, One thing I think we need to keep in mind is that adulthood is hard. Adulthood is a tough task. All of you logged in today. When you get home at night, chances are you're tired. That's because adulthood is an all-encompassing experience. However, when we talk about the transition process for people with any disability label, we tend to very narrow cast our outcomes. Even in our terminology, we say transition to work or transition to college. When those are two aspects of adult life, but they're two, maybe even important aspects, but they're only just two aspects of what should be a generally fairly complex and enjoyable life. This is what keeps me up at night, wondering on a regular basis, am I doing everything I can to actually transition the people I work with to lives of competence, dignity, and quality? That's my job. So that's kind of how I want to focus this today. And can't get it to move again. Is there something we can do to actually get this?
Peter, why don't you use the arrows on the top of the slide deck? There you go.
There we go. Okay. So let's start with what are important outcomes for adults with autism spectrum disorders. Paul Shattuck in 2012 conducted a comprehensive literature review looking at all the original research on services and interventions aimed at supporting success post-21. So they looked at work, education, independence, social participation. The parameters of the study, you had to be 18 years and older, it had to be published in English, and it had to be published between 2000 and 2010. As a result of this comprehensive literature review, they concluded that the evidence base for services for adults is underdeveloped and can be considered a field of inquiry that is relatively uninformed. Unfortunately, what that means is we know very little about how best to support adults from an evidence-based perspective. We have programs out there doing what I think are some good things, but is that really the best that we can do? Have we maybe lowered our sights in order to claim success? I don't have the answer, but I do know that adults with autism and how best to support them is a vastly under-researched area of intervention in almost every aspect. To further prove the point, Rue et al., also she's at the same lab as Paul is at Drexel, Paul Shattuck is. They analyzed the NLTS2 data, some aspects of it. For those of you who don't know, NLTS2 is the National Longitudinal Transition Survey, a massive federally funded transition study looking at outcomes of individuals with different disability labels at different intervals after graduation. And what Rue concluded was that young adults with autism have a difficult time following high school for almost any outcome you choose: working, continuing school, living independently, socializing, participating in the community, and staying healthy and safe. Now, we all know that this is further complicated by, in most states, that there really is sort of this services cliff when kids hit 21 or in some cases 18. So we have a system that actually is supposed to be working to transition kids to adulthood, but we don't necessarily have a system in the adult world, with major exceptions. Every state has their good programs. I'm not trying to say they don't, but it's not geared to support on the same level that we are with kids who are school-aged. And that presents, I think, an ongoing challenge for us. But I think you could argue, like, what is a good outcome anyway? From the time I was 21 to maybe 30, I think if if you asked my mother what her definition of a good outcome for her son was nowhere near what I was actually doing with my life. You know, she had this vision of, you know, church-going, hard-working, sober individual, and I was not church-going, and I liked to party, and I was working in a school for kids with autism at the time, making minimum wage and not really looking at a career. So, but I considered myself a success. I considered myself a good outcome. So who gets to decide what's a good outcome and what's not? You know, these are really sort of idiosyncratic questions, and they're also pretty complicated questions, I think. For example, if we just look at a few basic choices regarding what may be considered valued and social important adult outcomes for individuals on the spectrum. So let's make a dichotomy. So community employment versus being in a rehabilitation program. Are they going to live at home versus live in a group home versus independent living? If they live in a group home, what size? Is it 4 residents or 8 residents? Are they going to live in the country versus suburbs versus metropolitan area? Is it going to be full-time supervision versus part-time supervision versus sporadic or no supervision? Will they be kept protected from risk versus exposed to some level of risk versus full-time exposure to risk? And will they be allowed full sexual expression with boundaries of law, within the boundaries of law, versus sexual expression moderated by various restrictions? So if we just look at those choices, we have about 486 different outcomes that are possible, depending upon how people choose. So again, we are going to keep returning to this idea that everything that we do has to be highly individualized. Now, that's a word that we use a lot in our fields. It's an individual transition plan, an individualized education plan. It's an individualized habilitation plan. But often it's not. And I think if we actually start to think about what are those outcomes that are desirable for this person and then stretch beyond those outcomes to see if we can achieve a greater goal, that's really what we need to be doing. Because basically, transition outcomes are the sum of our choices. But I think the big question is, whose choices are we honoring? You know, I generally can fall to community employment. That's what I do. You know, I like to be able to get individuals jobs in the community. I work hard to do it. My school program, our goal is to graduate students who are already employed. Not employable, but employed. The reason being is that if they are employed, I can probably secure the adult system dollars to help keep them employed, but it's much more difficult to find the adult system dollars to help them get jobs. But now that's a choice that myself and the parents make generally on behalf of the individual. We collect data to see if this is something they like or not, but that's a choice. Others, however, may see employment as too scary, too risky, too difficult to obtain, too difficult to retain, or simply not preferable. I know many families who don't like the idea of having their son or daughter work because they see it as potentially risky, or what happens if they get fired. In those cases, they may rationally choose attendance in a rehabilitation program as a valued outcome. But would neither one or some combination be what the adult in question would want? And that is the ongoing challenge. Well, some basic characteristics of adulthood in the U.S., include, well, employed and able to maintain personal needs. So one of the first questions you ask somebody new, if you're at a party and you meet somebody new, you do a little chit chat, and you say, so what is it you do? Independence across environments, being able to make your way from town to town or within your city or within your neighborhoods, able to make and maintain friendships, able to make simple and complex choices and make your preference known, recognize and respond to challenges to your safety, big issue, patience and flexibility, managing temper and anger, learns from your mistakes, able to distinguish between wants and needs, handles pressure in a socially appropriate manner, recognizes that all actions have consequences, has a leisure skill repertoire that works for them, and engages in diverse yet consensual sexual relationships. Now, those are some basic characteristics. I think we can all agree. Like, there are permutations within each of those, but some characteristics not generally regarded as defining adulthood in the United States. Responding to a timer on a 5-minute interval. Naming all 50 states. Sorting 500 colored beads. Demonstrating unearned compliance to authority. Now, what I mean here is we are focusing a fairly significant effort on teaching safety skills, real community safety skills to our students. The problem is that as a field, we're really good at compliance training. So we teach kids to, in effect, be compliant to every new staff person we put in that room. And a core skill in being safe is non-compliance. So now we're grappling with how do we make this transition so that kids don't demonstrate compliance to people that they shouldn't. Correctly answering the questions, how old are you or when is your birthday? Basically, the reason why is that if somebody asks you that, they don't know the answer, so you could lie. You could basically say whatever you want, and they're not going to know the difference. Completing worksheets on a break from work. Responding to greetings only if presented in the same way every time. When I first got to the Epic School, almost every kid would respond to a greeting, but only if you said the greeting the same way every time. Now, this wasn't programmed. This wasn't planned. It's staff behavior was shaped that way. So now we have staff who will walk past a student and say, yo, my brother, how's it hanging? Or looking good today. Like, because we want them to be able to respond to greetings as they would in a more typical environment. Identifying the stages of moon, that is one of our state standard goals that is in almost every IUB. Reading 500 sight words, factoring a binomial equation. I put that in there just because for most of us, not knocking high school algebra, it's great. You learn how to think, it's critical thinking, but for most of us, after we learn to factor a binomial equation, the next time we factor a binomial equation is when our children take high school algebra, and we have to help them with their homework. Now, if you go on to be an engineer or something like that, you know, yes, that's part of your it's a necessity for you, but in many cases it may not be. Identifying weights and measures, but not applying either to cook a meal. My point with these slides is to say that we often spend a whole lot of time teaching skills that are not important, that we think are good, that we think are important, but really at the end of the day, don't carry much weight in terms of an included positive adulthood. Having spent most of my career working with adolescents and adults, one of the skills, I guess you could say, I've acquired over the years is the ability to look at different students and say, how come nobody taught you this? How did you get to be 16 and know all 50 states but not know how to cross the street? How did you get to be 12 and not know how to use a debit card? How did you get to be so-and-so? And there are so many more important skills in life that we don't really teach, but we focus on skills that we think are obtainable, we can teach in our classroom, that really have very little impact. Now, some people have criticized me because they think that I'm anti-academic skills. And I'm not. You know, if someone is bound for college or technical schools, academic skills are important. My only point is that academic skills alone do not result in a post-graduation life of independent safety, employment, and pro-social relationships. They may be great if you become a contestant on Jeopardy. I mean, I think that's the one place that academic skills alone will work for you, but you know, the fact of the matter is it's really the application of your academic skills that makes the difference, okay? It's why I assume all of you who are logged on today are good at what you do because you're able to apply the knowledge that you have to benefit your students, clients, or whoever it is that you work with. So if we're going to look at effective transition programming, you know, we really have to answer a series of personal and potentially high-impact questions, such as, okay, are they going to be employed? Do they want to be employed? Where do they want to be employed? Do they want to work mornings? Do they want to work afternoons? Like, what type of job is going to be best for them? Do they like standing up? Do they like sitting down? Is air conditioning? Do they like a whole lot of social interaction? Do they not like a whole lot of social interaction? Like, all of these things are important. Okay? Employment, by and large, is about far more than just the job task. It's about all of these other things. Independence. Well, with independence comes risk. And how much risk is acceptable? And what do we do to program to control for risk? Well, we still want to get guys to be as independent as possible. Individual diet, like how they can eat more healthily, while at the same time probably grabbing an occasional donut. Exercise for lifestyle, leisure. This is, I think, a big challenge for all of us. Like, most typical adults have some form of leisure skill, whether it's reading or riding their bike or playing tennis or whatever it is. Many adults on the spectrum do not. They have play skills that they were taught when they were little kids, but they don't have anything approaching adult leisure skills. And since it's such an important part of the typical lives, the lives of typical adults, I think it's something that we need to attend to much more consistently when we talk about transition. Safety issues, sex, not only from the point of view of safe from abuse, because the rate of sexual abuse among people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is unacceptably high. I mean, if it was 1, it would be unacceptably high. I'm not trying to, but it's higher than that of typical peers, and part of the problem is that our guys are perfect targets, because they tend to be very bad self-reporters, they tend to be very compliant. So minimally teaching kids to be safe from sexual abuse. How to have positive relationships, manage your physical health. We do know that the prevalence of mental health challenges in a group of adults with ASD is probably higher than it is with typical adults. And anxiety disorders appear to be the most prevalent underlying condition. In fact, there are some people who think that autism really is a complex anxiety disorder. I'm not one of those people, but just so you know, your finances, voting, and so on. So now, in the 5 years or so that we're doing transition planning, how do we address all of these? So this is what I said in the beginning. When we conceptualize transition planning and programming as only 2 work at college, we tend to miss a number of real critical aspects of post-graduation lives. Because this is really how life works. This really is my guide to transitioning. What you do every day matters more than what you do once in a while. This quote is from Gretchen Rubin. Gretchen Rubin is not a psychologist, not a behavior analyst, not an educator, not a social worker, not a speech and language pathologist, not an occupational therapist. She's an author. And she's the author of several books, including the New York Times bestsellers Better Than Before and The Happiness Project, both very good books if you are interested. But I like this, what you do every day matters more than what you do once in a while. When we start transition planning with our kids, and we tend to start around the age of 12, and when we develop 5-year plans starting at the age of 12, one of the first questions I ask just on sort of a lark is to say, does your son or daughter get up by an alarm clock? And almost universally, parents say no. And then I say, well, do you get up by an alarm clock? And almost universally, they say, yes, of course we do. And I say, well, then why don't you teach your son or daughter to get up by an alarm clock? And then I also frame that, do you know that's a safety skill? Because if somebody can get up by an alarm clock and get dressed by themselves, they don't need a paid staff to be with them during what is basically a more intimate time and a kind of a hidden time. So if we're talking about teaching safety skills, that's a big one. So then we can go through our day and see all those things that we do that may be actual worthwhile skills to incorporate into a transition program. For me, I think it all comes down to this very broad category of skills, adaptive behavior. Now, this is Bill Eward's definition of adaptive behavior. If we have any BCBAs who are logged in today, Bill Eward is one of the Trinity, who wrote a great book. So I think adaptive behavior is defined those skills are the ability to enable the individual to meet standards of personal independence, and that would be expected of his or her age of social group. I think the operational phrase in there is personal independence. I am a city boy. I like cities. I'm comfortable in cities. Cities don't overwhelm me. I am scared to death in the country. Like, put me out in the woods in the middle of the night, and I'm sure that there's an axe murderer behind that tree. I do not have that skill set. I'm very independent in my environment, but in this other environment, I'm not. Adaptive behavior refers to typical performance of individuals without disabilities in meeting environmental expectations. So it's sort of norm referenced. It's not sort of, it is. It's norm referenced. But then adaptive behavior changes according to a person's age, cultural expectations, and environmental demands. So our skill set in terms of adaptive behavior shifts as we come across new environments, new activities, new people, and we learn new things. It's an ever-expanding subset of skills. One of the things that I emphasize with my families and with my staff is that adaptive behavior will get you through times of no academic skills, better than academic skills will get you through times of no adaptive behavior. Now, what that really means is every single one of you listening today, every single one of you, at some point faked your way through a situation about you had no technical academic knowledge about the situation. You nodded your head, you laughed when other people laughed, you maybe threw in sort of a very inconsequential comment to agree with something, and then you ended that discussion so that you can safely get away and not get caught as a poser. You can have all the academic skills necessary to integrate into that conversation, but if you don't have those adaptive behavior skills to do it, you're not going to be able to do it. So it is this combination, and of the two, adaptive behavior is better. Now, why I have the Freak brothers here, just so you know, this was back in the 70s with Robert Crumb and Zap Comics, these underground comics. It's a modification of a line from one of their catchphrases. When we talk about adaptive behavior as part of a transition plan, though, I really want to point out that adaptive behavior goals are not simplified curricular goals. By that, I mean, sometimes there's this sense that when we talk about more non-academic life skills, sometimes people think, oh, well, you're dumbing down the curriculum, you're giving up on academics, and I always point out, I am not at all, I'm actually making it harder. Do you know how difficult it is to teach a young adolescent with autism to safely cross the streets in New York City? It is more difficult than teaching inferential calculus. Plus, it's more critical because if he lives in Manhattan, he is never more than 100 feet from an intersection. So I better teach him a way to be able to address this safely, because it's going to be an essential life skill and an essential safety skill. Adaptive behavior goals are not characterized by ADLs. Those are activities of daily living. I am not knocking activities of daily living. Those of you who know the phrase, it's just that they tend to describe chores, that's all. When people say it's activities of daily living, they mean like loading the dishwasher, doing the laundry. That's great, we all have to do that. But don't fool yourself that this is some integral, beautiful life skill. It's a chore, that's all. Probably the most challenging area of teaching complex adaptive behavior is that it's going to require a degree of simple and complex decision-making skills, which many of the individuals I work with don't have, but I think that's a function of us not teaching decision-making skills. We don't teach complex choice-making skills. So that's another area that we're looking at here. Adaptive behavior goals are central to the application of academic skills. We already talked about that. And adaptive behavior goals are not always highly preferred skills, but then again, sometimes they are. Personal hygiene would fall in this realm of adaptive behavior. But it's also a high effort skill that if you're not really aware of the social reaction to body odor, you might not think is all that important. So therefore, if it's not important, it's not preferred, so why would I do it? And therefore, you tend to skip. So there are those things that I think we always have to take into account, that even though we consider the skill important, the student or client may not, and how do we accommodate that person because we know the essential nature of this particular skill. This chart I got off the internet, so you know it's accurate. But actually, I got it from a number of different places, and there's some consensus. So I'm going to go with at least our inter-observer agreements on it. But this is what typical kids can do around the house between the age of 2 and the age of 11. So 2 to 4, they can help dust, put napkins on the table, put laundry. So they kind of help with almost anything. 4 to 7, they can sort of expand their repertoire of setting. They start to do few things independently. 8 to 10 years old, now they can actually make the bed, set into their table, dust, vacuum, okay? From 11 years on, they can do everything around the house. Literally, they can. Now, I am not saying that they do, but I'm saying that they can do everything around the house. Now, why I have this in here is that for most kids on the spectrum, it is sometime around the age of 11 or 12 that we start talking about, well, we need to start talking about adaptive behavior. We need to start talking about these life skills. Well, if we start at the age of 12, we're actually 12 years behind his typical growth. Where if we started looking at these things earlier on and then build upon skills that exist and then build upon those skills, then build upon those skills, we would be leading up to a more complex repertoire as opposed to waiting. So we look at, if you're here and you're between the age of 2 and 7, you have about 10 to 20% of your IEP focuses on adaptive behavior. When you get to be like 7 to 10, then it's between 20 and 35% focuses on. 11 years old, we're getting up to about 40%. By the time you're 18, it should be about 100%, is life in the community. Like, that's got to be what we're focusing on. But it's a systematic transition to that point and not this decision at some point, oh, we have to stop working on this and start working on this other set of skills. Just so you know, like we've published on this particular slide, I just wanted to throw this in here. But the parameters of effective adaptive behavior instruction really do include context, where instruction takes place. I can't teach street crossing unless I go out to streets. It just doesn't work. Now, we do have a grant pending that I unfortunately don't think we're going to get. It's a 3-year, $3 million grant to develop a whole virtual reality system to teach community-based safety skills, so kids will be able to, and using Google Street Maps, we'll be able to pull down images of their neighborhood and have them cross streets in their neighborhood, and we can actually set it up so they get hit in the virtual reality, so we can teach the dangers, so what to be aware of. That's one way that we can sort of supplant context, but at the end of the day, context is always going to be critical. Intensity, which is how often instruction actually takes place. With younger kids, we tend to provide a really intense educational experience. They get repeated practice over and over and over again. Malcolm Gladwell and his 10,000 hours of practice, which is actually not exactly accurate from what the research says. It's 10,000 hours of deliberate, focused practice, not just practice. But so if I want to teach you how to buy your lunch at Burger King at the age of 14 and I only go once a week, I don't think I'm going to get enough practice, enough intensity for you to actually acquire the skill. Efficiency, what's the easiest way to teach this skill? Transitive control, where does stimulus control lie? And then lastly, we're always asking about value. Why might this skill be important to the student? So one example would be that when we start working on street crossing, we will often start across the street from a Dunkin' Donuts / Baskin Robbins. So that if the student safely crosses the street, does everything correctly, then they go into the Dunkin' Donuts, and then they get their, excuse me, they can buy a coffee, a donut, ice cream, whatever. So we have a very naturally occurring reinforcer for successfully completing the skill. Then we may start 2 blocks away, so now you have to cross 3 streets before you get there. So that's the idea of how we can increase the value of what might initially be a very low value skill. Social behavior is adaptive behavior. From the perspective of evolutionary biology, I'm not entirely sure why I wanted to get into this today, but we are a social culture, we are as beings, we are programmed to be pro-social, to cooperate to some extent. I just have what's interesting is that where initially a lot of the research looked at for larger groups that it may actually be more related to the pair bonding sense that we needed this to actually, these social skills to then help support and protect the other person that we're with. So these have developed over a very long period of time, and there is a neurological basis for us as social beings, but how they present themselves in the real world is a cultural evolutionary phenomenon. The example I always point out is that we shake hands when we meet somebody new, basically because in the Middle Ages that showed you didn't have a weapon. That's why you shake with your right hand, because most people are right-handed, and that would be your weapon. Men wear ties because during the Renaissance, you know, the royalty in particular started to wear these very decorative outfits, and men were dressed in flourishes, and so other people started to do it, and then it slowly evolved into a tie. It's that kind of simple. It's always important to understand that we are, however, only social for a reason. All of you out there, I know every single one of you, at some point you were walking down the hallway at work, saw somebody you didn't want to talk to, and turned and went into the ladies' room or the men's room, even though you really didn't have to go. You avoided social interaction because there was no benefit in it for you. There was no potential positive reinforcement for engaging in that interaction. So this is a universal phenomena. So social skills are mediated by their outcome, and that they are used to acquire desirables and avoid negatives while navigating the environment and manipulating others. My girlfriend knows that if she asks me to do something, I will do it right away. If she tells me to do something, I will complain and I will put it off and I will eventually do it. So she has learned to ask me to do stuff instead of telling me to do stuff. So she manipulates my behavior very appropriately to get what she desires, and that works out fine for both of us, quite honestly. I accidentally, a couple years ago, ended up punishing, in the clinical sense, communication with one of my students. Now, how did I do this? He would walk past me. I would say, good morning, made-up name John. So I'd say, good morning, John. He would say, hi, Peter. And if he responded to me, I would ask him another question. And if he answered that, I would ask him another question, then I would sort of go on. If he didn't respond to me, I would say, John, and then he'd turn and say, hi, Peter, and I'd say, thank you, and then he went on his way. Well, what I was doing was when he gave me the response I wanted, I was putting more demands on him. I was saying, if you do this correctly, I'm going to make you do more work, which is really hard for you to be social and continue to answer these questions. But if you don't do it, then you just have to practice it, and then you can go on your way. So over the course of about 3 weeks, he pretty quickly learned that it's much easier, my life is much easier if I don't do it. He promised me once, and then we go on. So I had to sort of look at my own behavior and how am I supporting or not supporting the social communicative interactions of my students. In practice, what this means, and this is particularly with high verbal individuals, we see this challenge. Without like real effective generalized instruction in social skills, we often run into this say, don't do challenge. And what the say, don't do challenge means is that if we ask the person, what should you do in this situation, they can tell us. They can give us the correct answer every single time. Put that person in a situation and they don't do it. We see this a lot in the area of sexual safety, stranger danger, all of that. Like kids will tell us what they're supposed to do, but in practice, they don't do it. Why? Because in the real world, this goes far more complex than the instruction provided, or more likely, the individual doesn't see the utility of the skill, so why use it? Okay, there's also the fact that if he's been taught compliance for a very long time, that becomes sort of the predominant response as opposed to our new response. So vocal verbal behavior, language, is probably the most misleading skill that our students have, because, which is again why I don't use this high functioning, low functioning, because it's, oh, he has language, he's high functioning, which may not be true at all, but because there's language, we think so. Further in this area of social adaptive behavior, I have to point out that social skills are not linear. Social skills really are dynamic decision trees, but we tend to teach them in a very linear fashion. So I say hi, you say what's up, I say not much you, the student says not much, and then that's our task analysis, that's our instructional program. Well, social skills really are logarithmic. They are. They're very complex decision trees that function like this, but on a very simple, this is a very simple diagram, actually. So I come in and I say hi, and the second person can say, what's up? How are you? How's it hanging? What's happening? Then I can say, not much, fine, you, hanging well, been busy, you, where you been? To which then the person two can say, nada, been around, all good. Like, at each point, there's a decision to be made about how to potentially respond to the initial interaction. When we teach just in a linear fashion, we tend to teach skills that are good in only one particular situation and no other situation at all. If we can teach some of this social decision making, we actually teach skills that are useful across multiple environments. What this means in practice, a greeting is a social skill that is thought to be simple. However, further analysis shows that the skill, which most people take for granted, to be extremely complex. How a child greets a friend in the classroom differs from the type of greeting that we use at the two met at a local mall. The greeting used the first time the child sees a friend differs from the greeting later exchanged when they see each other 30 minutes later. Further, words and actions for greetings differ depending on whether the child is greeting a teacher or a peer. Greetings are complex, as are most social skills. Greetings also change over time. I know many, many adults with autism who high-five as a congratulation, where very few typical adults do. But that's because 20 years ago, high-fiving was hip. So we taught them to do that, and then nobody bothered to teach them a different response. All of which leads me to quality of life as a transition outcome. Is quality of life a human right? Well, according to Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, all persons enjoy the right to be left alone. The privilege of an individual to plan his own affairs, to shape his own life as he thinks best, do what he pleases, go where he pleases, the freedom to walk, stroll, or loaf. Now, why he thought walk, stroll, or loaf was the epitome of human existence, it's because this was the Supreme Court case that legalized vagrancy in the United States. It said that you could not be arrested just because you didn't have a home. So it was an important court, but this is what's based upon, that you have a right to do what you choose. In the field of ASD in particular, we're kind of late to the table in talking about quality of life. Now, the concept of quality of life in the field of intellectual disabilities has been around for over 30 years, like probably more like 40 to 50 years as a matter of fact. Only recently are we starting to talk about it within the context of autism. Why? Well, we are a relatively young field. I know it doesn't seem that way, but Leo Kanner, 1943, first articles in Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, late 60s, IDEA, well, Education of All Handicapped Children Act, 75 or 76. You know, when we first really started to work on kids on the spectrum, we didn't have this more capable end, this high verbal end, and we were worried about behavior and feeding and all kinds of stuff. So the idea of quality of life didn't make it onto our radar screen. It's only been in the past 10 years, I think, that people have started to actively talk about it. What research is out there tends to look at a very limited number of aspects, and a quantitative aspect, not qualitative. So, for example, research would say whether or not a person is employed or not, without then asking whether or not they like their job. Do they find benefit from their job? Are they socially included? And so on and so forth. So it's very sort of surface in its analysis. The same authors completed a meta-analysis on the topic of quality of life, and from 2004 to 2012, they found a total of 10 peer-reviewed studies. In general, the results of these studies indicated that adults on the spectrum had a lower quality of life when compared to people who were not on the spectrum. Now, most people would tend to agree that it has some face validity, maybe. But Parsons in 2015, now this is not really a great study. It was an online study, which are hard to do. There's participant bias, that those who want to reply, so you don't get a random sample. But did an online survey designed to the views of adults with ASD and their quality of life. 55 individuals responded. There was a whole lot of variation in responses, not surprisingly, okay? But what we also found out from this study is that a good number of the people who responded said they had a good life, that their quality of life was good. So does that mean that we've been judging quality of life from a very neurotypical point of view when we should be judging it from a very individualized, ASD-centric point of view? All of the previous research in quality of life that was discussed is all based upon third-party reports. How does mom think his quality of life is? How does the psychologist think his quality of life is? How does the sibling think his quality of life is? We're only now starting to look at how the people on the spectrum feel their life is. Now, there's actually a term for this discrepancy between our perception and the perception of somebody on the spectrum, and it's called disability paradox. And that term is used to describe when we typical people look at someone with a disability, and because they are different than us, we can't imagine that they have a good life. That we see someone who's a wheelchair user, and we think, oh, I would hate to be a wheelchair user. That has to be such a, but when the person may have a wonderful life and be very happy, and we sort of make this judgment from our point of view, which in many cases is not accurate. So what do we do moving forward then in our last 11 minutes? What I really do recommend all of you do is read this article. It's available online for free. It's by Ian Bannerman, Balancing the Right to Rehabilitation with the Rights of Personal Liberties, the Rights of People with Developmental Disabilities to Eat Too Many Donuts and Take a Nap. It was published in 1990. It really was, I think, the seminal article in my professional career that started me on this path of really looking at what do people want for their outcomes as opposed to what a third party wants for their outcome. A real critical skill for independence post-graduation is teach individuals to self-manage their behavior and to self-reinforce. Unless you want a staff person to have to be there and deliver token reinforcers or whatever it is every 5, let's work to sort of eliminate that typical person, that paid staff person in their life. And this is one way that we can do that, is if we can teach some self-management skills. Technology is changing the way that we look at transition and adult life. In many ways, technology is making our lives, the technical lives, simpler, and I think it's making it simpler for many individuals on the spectrum. For years, I've advocated that forget teaching money. I mean, if you can teach money, teach it, but don't teach it for more than 6 months. Then go right to a debit card and just teach purchasing, and we actually have some data to show that if we teach purchasing, then go to teach money, the kids learn money because now they understand what its use is, but be that as it may, advocated for the use of credit cards instead of money. Now, should I be advocating for Apple Pay? Should I say, well, forget the credit card, and they screwed me up with these chips anyway, so should I be looking at that? We now have assistive communication technology on iPads, GPS tracking for safety, worked for many years on travel training, teaching individuals to take a bus someplace. Now we're going to have self-driving cars or Uber. So what is technology going to bring to make the lives of people on the spectrum better? I do have a sort of caveat, which I really tend to avoid any special needs apps. I just think the most useful ones are the apps that are developed for typical people. For example, if you live in Manhattan, there's an app for the subway that can tell you when the next train is coming. There's an app for the buses that can tell you when the next bus is coming at your particular stop. And then for the bus one, if you then tap the stop you want to get off, it'll remind you. Now, these were developed for tourists, not for people with disabilities, but they're great. They're great little pieces of technology. There's an app now that if you put directions into your phone, you have to put these specialized insoles into your shoes, and you put the directions in your phone to walk somewhere. When you're supposed to make a right-hand turn, the right insole vibrates. So you make a right turn. When you're supposed to stop, if you come to the street, both insoles vibrate. So now here, by using a phone, someone who doesn't understand left, right, they can be more independent if I teach them how to use this. Again, developed for typical people so that they weren't walking through a strange city looking at their phone like a tourist. Except that life is not perfect. The fact of the matter is much of adult life is sort of good enough. I was taught at one point in my life to make a bed correctly, but I haven't really done it in 30 years. My life is really full of errors, but the most important skill I have is that I get to correct errors, not just not make errors. So I think that becomes the more important skill for us to teach. Teach safety skills. This is so pretty important. This is our decision tree for safety skills. I think it starts with 3 components. There's physical safety, social safety, and emotional safety. I don't do anything in emotional safety because it's not my area of expertise. Physical safety at one point combines with social safety, but it starts with simple discriminations: hot, wet, cold, dry, or hot, cold, wet, dry, light, dark, sharp, dull. Then it goes to complex, which are conditional discriminations: near, far, many, few, fast or slow. Then you get to multiple discriminations: cold, wet, and red versus cold, dry, and red. And then you get into situational discriminations: where, when, who, what, how, the stranger, mole versus stranger, male, the stranger at the mall versus stranger at home, fast car, my street, fast car across. That's how we get. Let me just say one last thing, and then we'll stop and take a few questions, okay? Let me just get to one last slide. You getting all this? This is speed reading. I have this in every talk I do about transition, and the fact of the matter is, don't dream of big. You got to think big. Shoot for the stars. If you miss, you're still going to end up in a better place than if you set the bar low, because you'll always succeed when you set the bar low. So think big, don't dream of big, and now we can take a few questions. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That is a very inspiring talk and so much information. And we did get a few questions. Actually, Kate, she asked, as a parent, how do I help motivate my adult ASD child to take the next steps? He's a college graduate.
First of all, when I work in situations like that, my mantra is shaping works with everybody. And I think sometimes when we have individuals or work with individuals who are college graduates and have so many cognitive abilities, we expect change to happen quickly and happen overnight. So I look at sort of initially very small increments of change that then I build into larger and larger increments of change, all of which build around some goal that they may have. So what's their step? The second thing, and I didn't talk about this, is it is very important as a parent, as a professional, and for this young man to understand issues of risk and be comfortable with risk. I think historically we've been so overprotective of individuals that they don't know how to do things when we're not there. Now, it doesn't sound like that's the case of your son since he went to college, but I would look at that. But and we actually use old school behavioral contracting. We sit down and say, listen, I really want you to do your laundry every week. What's it worth? Let's negotiate this. So we start adding little by little and building up to then whatever our end goal is going to be. It's a process, but it works.
And, you know, Peter, I actually also wanted to ask you a question about one of the slides that I thought was particularly useful for our audience. You had a slide that talked about the parameters of AB instruction. You said context, intensity, efficiency, transfer of control, and value. And, you know, one of the things we were hoping our audience could walk away with is some understanding of how to make use of these parameters of AB instruction. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think initially for me, the thing that I struggle most with is this value. Like, how do I make it worthwhile for you to do this? So that's one of the parameters that I'm always playing around with. Context, you know what, I think we should be successful in our classes. Like, we control every variable. The only documentation of how good we are is if we go outside our classrooms and work in the community, and we have to go out a lot. Like, otherwise, we don't teach. The example I usually use is if, let's say we have Johnny, who's 5, and your typical 5-year-old kid with autism, who doesn't exist. Like, we know that there's no typical autism anything. But let's say he learned color identification using discrete trial instruction, and it took 1,000 trials to teach him all 64 colors in the Crayola box. Great. You can do that in a day if you really want to. It's 50 sets of 20, big deal. But now he can tell you all the colors. He's now 16 and you want him to have lunch at Burger King. If you go once a week, like I said earlier, it'll take us 20 years to give him 1,000 instructional opportunities. And our inter-trial interval, the time between is too long, so he loses some of those skills. What we find is if we go every day teaching that stuff, and initially let's use Burger King as an example, so we go at initially 10:30 in the morning. The reason we go is when the menu turns to lunch and there's nobody there. We look at our core instructional sequence, which is entering, identifying the line, waiting, ordering, paying, retrieving, and sitting. Then we start to go to later and later. Now you're doing all the social stuff or the navigation stuff. Takes, for even my most challenged students, between 4 to 8 weeks to become completely independent. We can just wait outside and get it done. But what's amazing is that somewhere around week 4, you know what happens? He becomes part of a social community. Because all of those people who've been going to Burger King now know him. And he's not that kid with autism, he's John. And that's when sort of this transformative stuff occurs. Because they start saying stuff like, John, I'll hold a seat for you, don't worry about it. No, it's crowded, you can sit over here with me. You know, people sometimes try to help too much. We have cashiers who say, well, we know what he wants, why don't we have it ready for him? And I'm like, just don't, like, let him order, because he might change his mind. Like, but you become part of a social, we see it time and time again. If we give the typical community sufficient exposure, then they learn how to accommodate, and then they can be very accepting. And I also think that that's the most important safety condition we can give our kids, is that they're known by the community. So well, if people know you, yep.
This is very helpful. I think even that example is very, very helpful, particularly for our audience to kind of understand what are some of the skill sets and some of the concepts that they can work on to help young people and their families that are facing ASD at that particular phase in their life. So, you know, just really want to thank you so very much for your presentation this afternoon. We have actually come to our closing hour. It's 1 o'clock, but we want to thank everyone for participating today, and want to also let our audience know that we will be putting these slides up on our CTAC website. So please, you will be able to access the full presentation there. And we also encourage you to fill out the survey that you will get immediately following this particular webinar. And we want to direct you to some of our upcoming events. So on Tuesday, May 30th, we're going to be looking at collective impact, looking at one of the examples of how New York State's juvenile justice system has used this framework. So we encourage you to chime in on May 30th. And we're also going to be doing a webinar on group processes on June 7th. So we thank you all, and thank you very much, Dr. Gerhard.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Have a good afternoon.
You too.